on the last episode of the Keepsake box. The conversation started out in a very generic manner. They asked the questions that were asked by many of David's other acquaintances. Who's your family? Where are you from? What do you do? I answered in the way that I always did. I was a local, and my family had been long deceased. And of course, I worked in finance. Those were my readily prepared answers, and I hadn't ever been forced to explain further. But it was different with that guy. He seemed to have a vested interest in digging into every answer. He smirked as he addressed me. Finance, huh? You look very familiar, and it has very little to do with anything financial. Would you happen to be familiar with a young fellow named Angel, Shelley? Or would you prefer to be called Star? I was pushed into a corner, but unbeknownst to me, David had been pushed to his limit. He turned to the client and addressed him. You're obviously not aware of how this goes, so let me enlighten you. Let's start over and let's address the elephant in the room. This is Shelley. She's my girlfriend, and she is black. Shelley is in the accounting field and has occasionally been exposed to some shady characters. She is beautiful, intelligent, ambitious, and she will one day be my wife, if I'm lucky. Now, I can understand that our relationship may be problematic for you, and that's fine. You are certainly entitled to your opinion. However, I will not stand by idly while you hurl insults. I assume that you've looked into my life, but understand that I've looked into yours as well. I've avoided the conversations in reference to your personal indiscretions, as they were not relevant to our business relationship. But if disrespecting Shelley is on your agenda for today, understand that it will not work out well for you. With very little effort, Shelley and I can make sure that your wife and your black girlfriend become very familiar with each other. Now, are we going to talk business, or are we going to dig into each other's personal affairs? Without awaiting a response, David told me to stand. I did as I was told. He told me to extend my hand. Again, I did as I was told. David looked over to the client. He introduced us as if we hadn't been exposed to each other at all. I'd like for you to meet my girlfriend, Shelley. Without missing a beat, the client stood and shook my hand. He told me that it was nice to meet me. David smiled. So would your company be interested in retaining my services? Without consulting with his colleague, the client smiled stiffly as he addressed David. We would be happy to hire you as our legal representation. That should have been enough, yet it wasn't. David always had to push things a little further. He turned to me. What do you think, Shelley? Do you think I should take them on as clients? I responded without missing a beat. Sure, sweetheart, but I'd like to leave now. Time is money, and we've certainly spent too much of both in the company of these people. David agreed and asked the client if he wouldn't mind picking up the check to compensate for the time that we had spent participating in his foolery. He smiled and responded, that won't be a problem. David and I both stood. The client shook both of our hands and stated that he was excited about acquiring David's services. David extended his bent elbow, a signal to have me interlock arms with him. I did as he requested, and we exited. Just then, I realized that David had operated outside of his prearranged order of operations, a rare event. He had skipped step 2 and gone straight to the girlfriend phase. I looked over to David and addressed him. So, I'm your girlfriend now. David simply answered, yes, it has been decided. David suggested that we celebrate the acquisition of our new client and the beginning of our relationship. Without asking the details, I agreed. Chapter 8, How Audacious. Narrated by Shandora Warren. Music by Epidemic Sound. After dinner with the clients, David told me that there was something that he wanted to show me. We drove for approximately 10 minutes before reaching a beautiful high-rise building in the city. I glanced over to David. He smiled. David walked over and opened my door. Where are we? I asked. He told me to be patient. David and I entered the building, where we were greeted by a receptionist. Good evening, Mr. Herkowitz, she said. She smiled and addressed me as well. Good evening, ma'am. We both smiled back. David and I took the elevator to the 12th floor. It was at the very top of the building. To my surprise, There was only one door on the entire floor. Also, to my surprise, David had a key. David opened the door. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. The apartment was beautiful. It had gray and white marble floors and countertops. There were large panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed me to take in a view of the entire city. David took my hand and led me outside, where there was a large balcony and a swimming pool. "This is beautiful," I said. David turned to face me. "You deserve the best, right?" I paused momentarily. "Is this for me?" I asked. "Of course," said David. "Why do you think we're here?" Before thinking, I gave David a hug. It felt a little strange. In spite of the fact that David and I had been in each other's company for months, we hadn't shared much physical contact. I expected that things would be awkward afterwards, but as I attempted to depart from his embrace, David pulled me closer. That was the first time that he kissed me. Yes, after all that time. It was soft and gentle, much different than you would expect from someone with David's arrogance. But even though it was quite sensual, I felt nothing, not even a flutter in my stomach. Yet, he smiled at me, and I smiled back. David's next comment spoke to his arrogance. He said, "I've arranged for you to meet with an interior designer at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Don't be late." David assumed that I would accept his relationship announcement. He obviously assumed that I would like and accept the apartment as well. The fact that he had prearranged the meeting with the personal designer was proof of that fact. David's behavior was horribly audacious, but I had set the stage for all of it. Think about it. David had approached me with a pre-relationship request as if he were conducting a business transaction. He never asked if I wanted to accompany him, and I never declined. He gave me the schedule for the week, and I followed his lead, no questions asked. As audacious as he may have been, why shouldn't he have had those assumptions? I had allowed him to direct everything from the very beginning. Why would he assume that I would suddenly become resistant? And if I'm to be honest, David knew that I would accept the apartment for the same reason that I accepted everything else. I wanted it. I wanted the status and access to the good life, so I followed David's lead. And in spite of the fact that I wasn't immensely attracted to David, I liked the way we looked together. I wanted that apartment for the same reason. I liked the look of it all. David walked me through the rest of the apartment, holding my hand the entire time. It was strange. It was as if we were playing roles. I had been in love before. I knew the feeling of wanting to touch and be touched at all times. I had experienced the feeling of butterflies simply at the thought of Antonio holding my hand. It was different with David. I held David's hand because he held mine. It didn't feel genuine. I thought back to David's proposition. My mind wandered off and I began to put some things into perspective. David seemed to be convinced that we could enter into a mutually beneficial relationship and fall in love later. Maybe David could be a sea anemone of sorts. It would just require a change of perspective on my behalf. I pushed my feelings aside and held David's hand tightly as we exited the apartment. We entered the elevator and went down. David bypassed the lobby and went down to the basement floor. It was a parking garage. Immediately to our right was a pearl white Mercedes. It was beautiful. David pushed the keyless access button on the key and unlocked the door. He looked over to me and smiled as he opened the door. "Get in," he said. I was ecstatic. I sat on the driver's side while David walked over to the passenger side. He said, "This parking spot is solely reserved for you. It's a bit of a hassle with groceries and such, but I'll have someone do that for you." David handed me the keys and asked if I wanted to take the Mercedes for a spin. I inserted the key into the ignition. The Mercedes was so quiet that I didn't even realize that it started. David turned off the ignition and held the key in his hand. He smiled as he started the key with the start button on the key. I smiled back at him. Yes, that was the type of luxury that I deserved. Now, don't get me wrong, Lady was beautiful in her day, and I'd had the exact same level of excitement when Antonio gave her to me. But the Mercedes was different. That car had a level of luxury that I hadn't known existed prior to that point. I was convinced that I'd made the right decision in accepting David's proposition. I liked the way I felt in that car. I liked the way I felt in that apartment. That was the life that I wanted. That's the life I deserved. I drove the car around the city, feeling that I looked the part. I drove back to the parking garage and handed the keys to David. "What are you doing?" he asked. I was confused. I assumed that the car was offered pending my approval, but the typical David audacity slid right back in. He said, "I've taken all of the guesswork out of this, sweetheart. The car and apartment are yours. I don't know when your lease expires, but there's no need to wait that out. I'll pay any amount owed for the breaking of your lease. As for your car and clothes, I'll connect you with some people who will donate them. It'll be a nice little tax write-off." In my excitement, I had forgotten all about the arrogant side of David, but he was always sure to say something that reminded me. David's comment took me back to something that Grandma always said. Her voice came creeping into my mind. Never let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Unfortunately, that phrase also reminded me of Ron. David assumed that I was renting my house, and I decided to let him think that. If things didn't work out, I knew I'd always have a place to stay. And as for Lady, I had too much emotional attachment to simply donate her. I decided to just park her in Grandma's garage. But in the meantime, I had a new car to name. I decided to call her Simone. David reached into his pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. He addressed me. "I've taken the liberty of arranging an itinerary for tomorrow to take away the guesswork. It's just to get you started. I trust that you'll manage your time accordingly after that point." David exited the car and walked over to the driver's side. I stepped out as he opened the door. For the second time, David kissed me. He smiled and said, "See you tomorrow, Shelley. Please be on time." David walked away, leaving me with the car, the apartment key, and the note. I thought about the series of events. What would an itinerary entail? I unfolded the piece of paper. It started with me having breakfast with David at 7:30, followed by the 10 o'clock meeting with the interior designer. I had a meeting with an image consultant at 1 o'clock. I would meet with a nutritionist at 3 o'clock and a personal trainer at 5. Lastly, David would be at my new apartment to pick me up for dinner at 7 o'clock. And that was the official start of my relationship with David. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shinny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Shine, little girl.